Kansas Territory, late spring of 1872. The prairie wind blew hard that morning, the kind that scraped dust across your teeth and made the horizon look farther than it really was. The girl came walking out of that wind with torn shoes, blood at her heels, and a stubborn kind of fire in her eyes. Rowena Jane stood at the edge of the dirt trail, shoulders squared, chin lifted, even though her dress was ragged at the hem and her feet had long since stopped feeling where they stepped. She had been walking since dawn. 4 days now, maybe 5. The blisters had torn open sometime yesterday, and now her steps left little dots of red behind her in the dirt. She did not cry. Not when her husband left. Not when the wagon broke down outside of Great Bend and the man she trusted to fix. It took off with her money and her 2 children still asleep in the back. Not when she screamed herself hoarse and no one came. She had walked, because she would find them. She had no idea how far he'd gone, but she would find her babies. Olivia and Owen, 7 and 5. She whispered their names with every step. The sun was high when she stumbled over a rock and went down hard to her knees. She pressed her palms into the dirt and breathed like it might keep her from breaking apart. She stayed there, head bowed, shoulders shaking, but she still did not cry. A horse whinnied from somewhere nearby. She looked up. A rider had come from the rise behind her. A man in a wide-brimmed hat, dust-covered shirt, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He rode a tall roan with a scar down its flank, and he pulled the horse up sharp when he saw her, boots hitting the earth a moment later. "You all right?" he asked, voice low and rough from disuse. Rowena blinked up at him. Her mouth moved, but nothing came out. Her throat was too dry. He crouched beside her, not touching, just waiting. "You hurt?" She looked down at her feet. "Shoes are gone," she rasped. "Children taken," he stilled. "Taken, man I trusted, said he'd help. Took my wagon, supplies, my babies." His jaw clenched tight. "You remember his name, Luther Briggs." The words came out like a curse. "He was headin' west, said Dodge City." The cowboy's eyes narrowed. "You from around here, Iowa," she said. "Came south for a new start." "Should have known better." He stood and held out a hand. "I'm Clayton Archer. My ranch is about 10 miles east. Come on, we will get you on a horse, get your feet looked after, and then we will find your children." Rowena stared at his hand. Her pride screamed not to take it, but her legs were trembling and her skin felt like it would tear if the wind touched it again. She reached out. His hand closed around hers, warm and solid. He lifted her like she weighed nothing. Clayton turned and whistled low. "Come here, girl," he said to the roan. "Easy now." He helped Rowena up onto the horse, careful as anything, his hands steady under her arms, not lingering but not rushed either. She shivered as she sat astride, skirt tangled, knees raw. He climbed up behind her, arms bracketing hers, one hand taking the reins, the other resting lightly at her waist. "You trust me, Rowena Jane?" he asked, voice near her ear. She hesitated, then nodded once. "For now." He smiled softly. "That's good enough." They rode for hours, the prairie stretching wide around them, the sun chasing their shadows across the dirt. Rowena leaned back just a little, her body too tired to hold itself upright. Clayton adjusted his hold, keeping her steady. When they reached the ranch, she barely noticed. Only the sudden stillness and the quiet cluck of chickens made her blink awake. He slid off the saddle and caught her as she swayed. He carried her inside, through a plain but clean kitchen, past a stone hearth with a quiet fire, and into a room with a small bed and smooth pine walls. He set her down gently and knelt to look at her feet. "Going to clean these," he said. "It will hurt some." She nodded. "I have had worse." He worked in silence, hands careful, cleaning the blood and dirt, wrapping the worst of the cuts in cloth he dipped in cool water. When he was done, she lay back against the pillow and finally let her eyes close. "You have anyone left?" he asked softly. "Just them," she whispered. "Olivia and Owen. I am all they have." He touched her hand. "Just a brush of fingers. Then we will get them back." She woke to the smell of stew and the sound of a storm far off in the distance. The ache in her feet had dulled. Clayton was at the stove, ladling food into a bowl. He walked over and handed it to her with a spoon. Rowena took it with both hands. Her eyes met his. "You do not even know me," she said. "I do not need to," he replied. "I saw the way you walked through hell to keep going. That is enough." She ate slowly, the warmth chasing the cold from her bones. When she finished, she set the bowl aside and looked at him again. "You believe me about what he did?" "I do." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "And I have seen Luther Briggs before. He is scum. If he went west, I know men in Dodge who will have seen him." Rowena sat up straighter, hope flickering. "You would ride with me." "I would ride for you," he said simply. She stared at him, heart thudding. "Why?" Clayton looked at her like she was something rare and breakable. "Because something in me changed the moment I saw you standing there in the dirt, and because no mother should be left chasing her children alone." Her breath caught. He stepped close, slow and careful. "You do not have to trust me for always, but let me help." She nodded. A single, quiet nod. That night, the wind howled through the cottonwoods, but inside the little ranch house, Rowena slept like someone who had finally stopped falling. And outside, Clayton stood on the porch, rifle in hand, eyes on the dark horizon, already planning how he would bring her babies home. The morning after the storm, the ground steamed under a rising sun, the air thick with the smell of wet cedar and ash. Clayton saddled his buckskin gelding and packed light rifle, jerky, a tin of coffee, a map folded 4 ways and worn soft at the creases. He moved quiet, mindful of the door cracked open behind him. Rowena stood just inside, wrapped in a faded wool shawl he'd left on the bedpost. Her hair hung in a loose braid over one shoulder, and her eyes followed his every motion. "You going alone?" she asked. He cinched the saddle and nodded once. "Only quicker that way. Dodge is near a day's ride if I push hard." She stepped out onto the porch, the shawl clutched at her throat. "What should I do while you're gone?" "Rest. Let your feet knit up some. There's bread in the bin, and I left a pot of beans warming. Firewood stacked behind the house." She hesitated. "And if someone comes?" Clayton slid the rifle from its scabbard and handed it to her. "Ain't likely, but if they do, point and pull." She took it with both hands, awkward but determined. "I'll manage." He climbed into the saddle and looked down at her from under the brim of his hat. "You got a way of holding yourself like the wind can't move you." "I've had to," she said. He gave her a look that lingered, then turned the horse and rode out without another word. By mid-morning, Clayton's shadow stretched long across the prairie. He passed a stand of cottonwoods near a creek where the last frost hadn't yet killed the wild onions, then crossed through a burned-out patch of grassland where lightning had struck 2 nights ago. He didn't stop to water the horse until the sun hung overhead. Outside Dodge, he pulled up at a livery stable on the south edge of town. The stable hand, a boy no older than 15, came out with a curry comb half slipping from his fingers. "Looking for a man rode in recent. Tall, heavy-set, scar at his jaw. Might have had 2 children with him, blonde girl and boy." The boy scratched behind his ear. "Saw one like that 2 days back. Bought oats, asked where to find a widow house." Clayton's eyes narrowed. "Which one?" "Mrs. Halpern runs the one on Vine." He might have gone there. He tossed the boy a coin and turned the gelding toward town. Dodge City pulsed with heat and noise, dusty wagons, oxen steaming in the sun, men shouting near the stock pens. Clayton threaded through it all, jaw tight, eyes scanning. Vine Street lay quieter, half in shadow from the taller buildings along front. He tied off at the corner and strode to the Halpern place. The door creaked open under his hand. A woman in her 40s, stout and sharp-eyed, looked up from where she was scrubbing the baseboard. "Not open till sundown," she said. "I'm not here for pleasure. Looking for a man sold 2 children to a passing drover. Name's Luther Briggs." Her hand stilled. "That name's no stranger. He stayed one night. Left early next morning. What did he say about the children?" Claimed they were his niece and nephew. Said their folks had died in Topeka. But he never looked at 'em when he talked. Girl kept crying. Boy wouldn't speak. Clayton stepped forward. "Where'd he go?" "South, last I heard. Left with a man named Greeley. Drives cattle for the Armstrong outfit down near Cimarron Crossing." Clayton nodded once, then turned to leave. "You their kin?" she asked. "No," he said, "but their mother's waiting." Back at the ranch, Rowena worked in silence. She cleaned the hearth, boiled water to scrub her dress, and stitched a new hem by firelight. Around midday, she found a pair of men's boots tucked beneath the bed. Too large, but she stuffed them with cloth and tied the laces tight. When she stepped outside, she moved with a limp but walked steady enough to haul water from the well and feed the horse that paced the pen. By the time the sun dipped low, she'd boiled beans with wild onion and fried cornbread on the stoveplate. She left a plate covered by a tin lid and sat on the porch with the rifle across her knees. When Clayton returned, dusk pressed lavender shadows across the prairie. He dismounted stiffly and walked up with the slow step of a man who'd ridden hard. "They were in Dodge," he said without preamble. "Sold to a drover named Greeley, headed south." Rowena stood. "Alive, far as I can tell." Man at the livery said the girl fought back. "Greeley won't have an easy time keeping her quiet." She swayed slightly. "How far's Cimarron?" 2 days' ride if we take the river route." He looked down at her boots. "You feel up to it." Her voice was steady. "I'll ride." He didn't argue. They left at dawn. The sky was pale and the wind was kind for once, brushing soft over the grass. Clayton brought a second horse, a calm dun mare with a broad back and slow gait. Rowena mounted without help, though her jaw tightened with the motion. They rode side by side, speaking little. The land rolled out before them in soft hills, the red clay showing through in places where the buffalo grass had thinned. Birds wheeled overhead, and once they passed a coyote loping through a dry creek. Rowena watched it go, her hands loose on the reins. "Why do you live alone?" she asked after a long stretch of silence. Clayton didn't answer right away. "Lost my brother 3 winters back. Drove cattle together, built the ranch from nothing. After he passed, I didn't see the point of filling the place." She nodded slowly. "Loss hollows things out." He glanced over. "You loved your husband." A pause. "I loved the man I thought he was." Clayton didn't push further. They rode on into the deepening light, the quiet between them no longer empty. When they made camp, it was by a creek that ran cold and shallow across the rocks. Clayton built the fire while Rowena laid out bedrolls. They ate in silence, then settled under the wide sky. The night air was cool, the stars sharp as cut glass. As she lay beside him, Rowena whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" "For not asking me to be less than I am." Clayton turned his head, his gaze meeting hers in the dark. "You'd never let a man ask that of you." She smiled faintly. "No, I wouldn't." He reached out slow and touched her hand where it rested between them. She didn't pull away. They lay there with fingers twined, the fire crackling low, the sound of the creek steady as breath. And for the first time since the wagon left her behind, Rowena didn't feel alone in the world. They reached the edge of Cimarron Crossing beneath a slate-colored sky, the wind carrying the scent of river silt and cattle dung. The land here was flatter, open in every direction. dotted with wagon ruts and canvas tents pitched beside freight wagons. Campfires flickered low as dusk settled, and the heavy noise of men drinking drifted over from the saloon tent pitched near the water. Clayton reined in just past a line of picketed horses. "Stay close," he said, eyes scanning the camp. "These boys drink hard and speak harder." Rowena dismounted without waiting for help. Her legs wobbled, but she straightened them with a breath and walked beside him, the hem of her skirt catching in the dry weeds. At the cook fire, a man with a canvas apron wiped his hands on a flour sack and squinted their way. "Looking for someone?" Greeley, Clayton said. "Drives for Armstrong outfit." The cook jerked his chin. "Big fella with a busted tooth. Tent past the second wagon." They moved through the camp without speaking, the sound of their boots muffled by the dust. A dog growled low from under a wagon bed, then fell silent. The tent in question stood crooked, its flap open. Inside, a man was bent over a crate sorting tins. "You Greeley?" Clayton asked. The man turned, squinting through the gloom. "Who's asking?" Clayton didn't answer. Rowena stepped forward. "I'm the mother of the children you bought." Greeley looked at her for a long moment, then straightened. "He said they were orphans." "He lied," she said. Greeley's face changed, then not guilt, not shame, but something tired. "They're over with the cook's wife. She's been watching him since he rode out north this morning." Rowena's breath caught. "He's gone," left before dawn, said he had business in Garden City, took the pay and rode light. "Why didn't you go with him?" Clayton asked. "I ain't paid to chase ghosts," Greeley muttered. "And I didn't like the way that girl looked at me. Like she knew I'd done wrong." Rowena pushed past him without another word. She found the children near the edge of the camp, sitting beside a narrow stream under the watch of a woman shelling peas into a tin bowl. Olivia was braiding clover stems into a circle, Owen's face pressed into her shoulder, his eyes closed. Rowena stepped into the light. Olivia looked up. Her mouth opened and she dropped the clover crown. "Mama!" Rowena fell to her knees beside them, arms outstretched. Olivia launched forward and Owen followed, their little bodies colliding against her chest. She held them so tight her arms shook, her face buried in their hair. Neither child made a sound. They just held on. Clayton stood a few steps back, hat in hand, watching her whole body fold around them like she could shield them from the past with sheer will. The woman with the peas stood and walked away without a word. Later, after the children had eaten and Rowena had washed their hands clean in the river, she sat with them beneath a cottonwood. They were asleep before the moon rose fully, curled against her like they'd never been gone. Clayton approached quietly, boots careful in the grass. "They'll need time," she said. "So will you." She looked up. "I don't know how to thank you, don't need thanking. I didn't think I'd ever see them again." "I did," he said. She studied his face in the silver light. "Why?" "Because you never stopped walking." She wrapped her arms tighter around her children. "You don't have to stay, I know. But if you did," she said, eyes steady, "we could build something, not right away, but in time." Clayton let out a slow breath. "I've got land. A house that's too quiet, a barn that could use a boy's hands, a garden where a girl could plant clover." Rowena's lips trembled. "I can cook so, and I'll work beside you every day." He stepped forward then, dropped to one knee in the grass beside her and reached out. She took his hand. Neither of them said the word for what this was. They didn't need to. They left the next morning just after dawn, the children riding double on the dun mare, Rowena leading while Clayton rode close behind. The sun rose slow and steady at their backs, and for the first time in weeks, Rowena didn't count her steps against the pain in her feet. She counted them toward home. The house had changed in their absence. It wasn't larger, but it felt fuller. The children's voices echoed off the wood-paneled walls. and the scent of wild mint Rowena had tied in bundles above the kitchen sill drifted through the air. The mare's hooves still thudded across the packed dirt behind the barn each morning, but now Owen watched from the fence rail, eyes sharp, questions always ready. Clayton built a second cot by the hearth, low to the ground, sturdy as anything he'd ever made. Olivia helped sand the edges with a scrap of wool, her brow furrowed in quiet concentration. When Rowena passed by, arms full of linens, she paused just long enough to rest her hand on her daughter's shoulder. Olivia didn't flinch. Clayton caught that moment from the doorway, his hand still holding the latch. "She's steady," he said. Rowena folded the linens over her arm. "She always was. Just needed a place to be at." They sat together that evening on the porch, a pot of beans cooling behind them, the children tucked into their cots with the windows open to let in the breeze. Clayton rolled a cigarette but didn't light it, just turned it between his fingers. "You ever think of leaving Kansas?" he asked. Rowena leaned back against the post, her ankles crossed beneath her skirt. "I thought about Missouri once, before the war, before I married, but nothing real came of it." He nodded slowly, his eyes on the pale line of the horizon. "I've only ever left to trail cattle, never stayed anywhere else." "You don't talk much about your brother," she said. "He was 6 years older, took the brunt of the world so I wouldn't have to. After he died, I didn't know how to live quiet, just kept working." Rowena looked at his hands. "You work like someone still trying to earn his place." "I never figured I'd share it." She didn't speak for a long while. The wind moved through the grass in soft waves, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called once. "I was married young," she said at last. "Too young, I think. I thought keeping house and bearing children would be enough." Clayton didn't turn toward her, but he listened. He was kind at first, then he wasn't, not all at once, just piece by piece. Her voice didn't shake, it didn't need to. "By the time he left, I'd stopped hoping he'd change." He looked at her then. "You think you'll ever trust a man again?" "I already have," she said. "I just haven't said it aloud." Clayton set the cigarette down on the step. "I don't want you to say it unless you mean every word." "I won't." She turned her face toward him. "But I meant that." The moon rose behind them, casting pale light across the porch. Neither moved to go inside. The next morning, Owen followed Clayton to the barn without being asked. He didn't speak, just trailed 2 steps behind, watching every motion. Clayton handed him a brush without a word and pointed toward the gelding. Owen hesitated, then set to work, his strokes clumsy but willing. "He's quiet," Rowena said later, watching from the doorway. "He's watching everything," Clayton replied. "That's how you learn." She passed him a mug of coffee, her sleeves rolled high, a smear of flour across her cheekbone. "Did you ever want children?" "I didn't let myself think on it," he said. "Didn't seem fair to wish for something I couldn't keep." "You think you could keep us?" "I think I'd give everything I've got trying." That night, Olivia brought Clayton a drawing made with crushed berries and charcoal. It was simple: a house, a field, 2 horses, 4 stick figures with smiling faces. She handed it to him without speaking and waited, arms folded tight. He looked at the paper, then at her. "You draw this," she nodded once. "I don't look that tall," he said, eyebrows lifting. "You're not," she said curtly, then grinned. Rowena watched from across the room, her apron still damp from washing. When Olivia climbed into her cot and pulled the quilt to her chin, Rowena crossed to Clayton and rested her palm against his back. "I don't know how we got here," she said softly. "Doesn't matter," he said. "We're here." Later, when the house had gone still and the fire burned low, she reached for his hand in the dark and didn't let go. And when the sun rose, she was still holding it. A soft rain came through in early June, soaking the fields and turning the earth rich and black. It fell quiet and steady for 2 days, and during that time, The world outside the ranch seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the walls breathed with warmth, firewood crackling in the hearth, bread rising in a tin pan on the stove. Children's footsteps muffled against the worn floorboards. Rowena stood beside the table, drying her hands on a cloth while Olivia practiced shaping letters on a scrap of butcher paper. Owen sat cross-legged on the floor, wooden blocks in front of him as he tried to build a fence that wouldn't fall. Clayton, seated near the fire, was stitching a tear in his sleeve with thick thread, and a needle he handled like it was a tool no different from a hammer or a bridle. He glanced up when Rowena leaned against the table. "You hear from that neighbor downriver?" she asked. "Van Lier," he nodded. "Rode by yesterday while you were down in the root cellar. Offered to sell us 2 milk cows come July. Said he's got more than his barn can hold. That'd give us fresh cream, butter, even cheese if I can get the rennet to set right. I figured you'd know what to do with it." She brushed a curl from her cheek. "I've been thinking about planting near the creek, peas, maybe squash. The soil's softer after the thaw." "You planning to do that all by yourself?" She looked at him then, her eyes steady. "No, I'm done doing things alone." He set the needle down and rose, crossing to her. "Then let's build it together." That night, after the children had gone to sleep and the rain tapped soft against the windows, Rowena sat at the kitchen table with a folded piece of paper in front of her. She turned it once, then again. Clayton came to stand behind her, his hand resting at her shoulder. "You've been holding onto that for a while," he said. It was the marriage certificate from her first life, creased and worn, the ink faded. She looked down at it, then slowly reached for the lamp. With a match, she lit the edge, holding it by the corner until flame curled it into ash. She dropped it into the basin and watched it burn out. "No more ties to what was," she said. Clayton didn't speak. He just leaned down and pressed a kiss to her temple, his hand tightening over hers. In the weeks that followed, the ranch changed shape. Clayton built a low fence along the east pasture for the cows arriving in July. Owen helped drive in stakes, his small hands wrapped around the mallet, determined. Olivia read aloud from an old almanac they found wrapped in oilcloth in the barn loft, her voice growing steadier with every page. Rowena started a garden near the creek, just like she said she would. The first sprouts pushed through in late June, and she knelt in the dirt every morning to check their growth. Sometimes Clayton joined her, handing her a tin cup of water or just watching, quiet and content. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the cottonwoods, Clayton brought out a small box he'd carved himself. He gave it to Rowena without ceremony, his hands rough from fence work, his forehead still streaked with sun. She opened it to find a ring, simple, silver, set with a single river stone. Not bought, but made. She ran her finger over its edge. "You carved this?" she asked. "Smelted the silver from an old belt buckle," he said. "Stone came from the creek bed out past the west ridge." She held his gaze. "You want it to mean something." "I want it to mean everything." She didn't answer with words, just took his hand, slid the ring onto her own finger, then kissed him with her whole heart in it. They married under a cottonwood tree near the garden, with only the children and the sky as witnesses. Owen held the ring. Olivia brought wildflowers wound into a crown. It wasn't grand, but it was full of peace, of promise, of a life earned one quiet day at a time. Clayton built a second bedroom off the back of the house that summer. Olivia helped carry boards, and Owen hammered nails with a ferocity that made them all laugh. The room smelled of fresh pine and open windows. Rowena filled it with patchwork quilts and shelves for books they'd yet to collect. By the first frost, the garden had been harvested. The cows had calved. Olivia had taught Owen his letters, and Rowena had a tin of cream set aside for winter butter. Clayton, kneeling at the hearth one evening, turned to see his wife humming softly as she mended a shirt, her children nearby, her face calm. "Did you ever believe life could be like this?" he asked. Rowena looked up. "No," she said, "but I hoped." He crossed to her and kissed her slow, his hand against her cheek. "You gave me back the sound of a home." She rested her forehead to his. "And you gave me back the ground beneath my feet." Years passed. The house grew into its bones. A proper barn went up on the south end of the pasture. Olivia began teaching local children their letters in the shade of the cottonwood. Owen trained a colt that took to him like a brother and rode it bareback through the tall grass. Rowena and Clayton never stopped building fences, shelves, small joys. They never raised their voices. They never needed to. They moved in rhythm, two hands on the same plow. They grew old together in the quiet way people do, when they've known what it means to lose everything and still stand up again. And with every sunrise over the Kansas prairie, they began again, not from nothing, but from love, steady as the wind that had once tried to take her down, and never would again.